Well, good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here. And it occurred to me when Matt was telling me who was invited here to the day, and that it was all the people who had sort of shown interest and won awards and doing innovative things with their technology and teaching. It occurred to me that I had nothing interesting to say, so I've tried to put together my presentation with that in mind. What I'd like to do, this is my opening thought, is I'd like to sort of move from being very practical and to think about some fairly practical ways to think about teaching and technology, to move out, to ask us to think about some of the larger contexts about what's happening to the academy, what's happening to us as faculty in thinking about technology. And occasionally I may skip a slide to try to keep us on track time-wise here, and that the version of PowerPoint on this machine wasn't showing certain things that I had in my show, like data. So I'll just skip those. So I have to take my word for it. I have 3 points. They're in the lighter color here. And then 2 sort of larger points. My 3 points are this, that the number one thing we should think about using technology to do is to slow down learning, right? And that's a little bit counterintuitive, but I feel like that's one of the most important things we can do in thinking about technology is what does it mean to slow down learning? I want to talk briefly also about the idea of social learning and getting students to think about what it means to learn socially. And the provost spoke very eloquently to those dimensions, so I'll speak less eloquently but at great length about them. I'm just kidding. Reminds me of a colleague who just got an article critique back from a journal with this critique. Tell me how Syrian this is. Vague, yet overly detailed. And then the third that I want to just touch on briefly is the idea of constructive learning, having students making things and making them public after they make them. And then wrapped around these 3 points are sort of 2 larger points. One is the idea that we can use technology to shift the time and space of learning, and I'll try to say a little bit about that without being too trite. And then the last point that I'll leave you with is this idea that I think that one of the things that we don't talk enough about is that introducing technology in serious, meaningful ways into education is expanding kinds of learning that we are really, at the moment, at a loss to know what to do with. So that's where I'll end. All right, let me start with the idea of shifting the time and space of learning. And here, is this too loud? Okay. It just seems really loud to me, but so do the voices in my head, so. This is work that I've taken from Barbara Walvert, who used to be the director of the KNEP Center at Notre Dame. And she has a very interesting construct where she asks the question, where does learning take place and why, right? And I also should mention that this is being taped and it's going to be broadcast through your new lecture technology or whatever. So all of these slides and everything will be available to you. So Barbara asks, where does learning take place and why? And she essentially says that there are 3 main places where learning takes place in the very broad sense. You have class time, right? That's when everybody's together. You have student time. That's when students are relatively alone. Maybe they're with other students, but they're basically alone. And then you have teacher-student time, the interaction between teacher and student. But that most of the educational scene in higher education could be divided into those 3 times. She then says that there are really sort of 3 main things that happen in the educational setting. There's what she calls first exposure, right? Which is where students first get introduced to material and they first start to process it. Then there's learning processing, right? That's where people really start to learn something and really start to integrate it. And then there's feedback, assessment, interaction, etc., where you get a sense that if what you're learning is what you ought to know. So her question is fairly simple, and this is the one that I want to just throw out that I think is a good way to begin thinking about teaching and technology. Where did these things happen? Traditionally, in a traditional situation, first exposure happens in the classroom when everybody's together, right? learning processing, the difficult work of learning, happens when people are alone or in isolation. And oftentimes, feedback happens too late. Right? So that's often the situation we're in. When the most expensive resources are all assembled in one place, we're doing the least important thing. When people are by themselves with no one to work with, they're doing the most important thing. And then this other critical part of the process is happening after it would be timely. Okay? So a fundamental question is just to ask, how can information technologies make an intervention into that? Obviously, it's not the only thing that changes, but how can we imagine, for example, shifting first exposure prior to class time so that something else could happen in class? Right? What would have to happen prior to class time around first exposure to make the next part, the learning processing, happen in class when people are assembled together? Right? Similarly, you could ask, what would have to happen in terms of giving students feedback that might connect that process more to learning? Right? That doesn't disconnect the assessment process from learning, but actually connects it. Right? So just thinking about those three spaces: class time, teacher-student time, first exposure, the hard work of learning, processing, and feedback. What could change the way that those configure, and how could technology play a role? Oops. Let me give you an example. And you're going to have wonderful examples, the short previews, and then you're going to have the much deeper examples. So I'm going to really race through examples, and I'm just going to pretend like all I have to do here is cover my material. And you'll really learn something in the sessions. Dan Bernstein used to be at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He's now at University of Kansas running the Center for Teaching. He also ran the peer review of teaching project. He had a problem. He realized that the questions he was asking on exams, he teaches experimental psychology. He realized that the questions he was asking on exams were lousy questions. He'd only been asking them for 20 years, so this wasn't too damaging of an insight. But he decided they were not the kinds of questions that psychologists ask themselves, right? So here's an example of his old question. What were the reinforcing consequences in the Welsh, Bernstein, and Luthon's restaurant study, and how were the consequences identified? Right? So that would have been a typical question that he would have asked on an exam, sort of medium-length answer question. He decided to rewrite all of his questions into much more authentic questions. So here's his new question. Suppose you were asked to implement a motivational program in a business setting. It is a small production unit with 25 employees who can engage in the following activities: production planning, inventory delivery, direct production, packaging, and marketing. Based on your understanding of the study of the fast food restaurant, that's the Welsh, Bernsteins, and Luthon study, how would you proceed to improve the quality of the employees' work by using access to activities as a motivator, etc.? You get the point, right? He's not asking about the article. He's asking them to make use of what it is they know and to make use of it in an authentic way. So painstakingly, he rewrites all of his exam questions. Here's what happens. So I'm an English professor, so I'm not that great with bar graphs, but that's not good. Right? So performance goes incredibly down. So he starts experimenting with all these different things. One of the things he does is he's very influenced by Barbara Walford's work, so he thinks about how does he move first exposure out earlier, so he starts using his course management system to post self-assessment quizzes. The students take the quizzes before they come to class. He realizes which 3 out of 10 main concepts in a particular chapter they don't understand. Instead of lecturing for an hour, 70% of which is on material they fully understand, he now lectures for 15 minutes on the 3 things that they have already demonstrated they didn't understand. He doesn't spend any time in class on the stuff they seem to have grasped. They then spend the rest of the time in class talking really meaningfully about more authentic things, higher order applications. So that's great. Class is better. He has to listen to himself less. They have to listen to him less. They're better prepared. Everything is better, except he cannot get the exam scores to budge. Can't get them to move. He refuses to go back to his old exam questions. Then he reads this story written by Grant Wiggins, who some of you may know. He's mostly a K-12 curriculum theorist, about the welding teacher in high school. And this welding teacher, when he wants to give his final exam, he takes 7 welds, from the messiest, ugliest weld you've ever seen in your life to the most gorgeous weld, perfect weld, and 5 gradients of welds in between. And he lays them out from worst to best on a table. And every student in the welding class brings their final project up to the table, and whichever one it looks like, that's their grade. Now, I think we can all agree this is like an assessment utopian fantasy for all of us, right? My paper on Heidegger. You know. But what's powerful about that story is this fantasy that the criteria for excellence would be so available to students that they would see it themselves. That it wouldn't be about Dan's criteria for excellence. It would be about them making intrinsic their criteria. So he realizes that learners need to recognize quality work, right? And he wasn't teaching that part of the process, right? He was teaching all the other parts of the process. He wasn't teaching the part of the process that students need to learn what it means to recognize quality work. He was grading by exam. So what he does, he takes a little version of the welding story, and he, in Blackboard, posts prior year's exam responses, an A answer, a B answer, and a C answer. And he puts them in folders in Blackboard, and he puts the students into groups of 4 and 5, and he doesn't label which is the A, the B, and the C. And he has them argue about which is the A answer, the B answer, and the C answer, and why. Right? Then, another semester it evolves. He decides after that, he has them actually generate questions and answers and then read each other's, and then comment on each other's answers. But the idea is that they're essentially rehearsing the exam for each other. He's not reading any of this. He's not responding to any of this. So it's an idea that would scale. They're rehearsing what it means to write for these exams. Right? But he's confident that that's not a trivial or cheap thing, because he feels, as Lloyd Bond at the Carnegie Foundation would say, there's nothing wrong with teaching to the test if it's the right test. Right? He's confident he's got the right test. So teaching to the test doesn't bother him. Right? So, conveniently, one of the slides that won't play in this version of PowerPoint is the stunning data as a result of these interventions. So you just have to take my word for it. But in the slide you can see here, you'll notice that the grades have gone back up. And that actually he had a very strange curve in the earlier, but he now has a normal curve. And the A's aren't quite back up to where they were, but they're almost back up to where they were, and the D's and F's are down considerably. With the combination of everything, the first exposure shift, the rehearsal, he doesn't credit any one thing, but it was the missing piece. And it was that he had fully shifted those 3 pieces. Shifted the first exposure, done more meaningful things in class, and created an integration between assessment and learning processing that had been a complete disconnect in his teaching before. All right, slowing down learning. And again, like I say, this is something that I've been working with, especially in the humanities, for 10 or 15 years. And in part, it was because it appeared the technology was so good at speeding up everything that using it to slow down learning seemed like a really important thing to focus on. And by slowing down learning, what I mean is slowing down the most important part of whatever it means to learn the most important thing you're trying to teach. So in everybody's field, there's something, or a few things, just a few things, that are so critical that you need to slow students down and let them really understand them. It's what Grant Wiggins calls the difference between uncoverage and coverage. Right? Not what do I need to cover this semester, what are the 3 things I need to uncover with my pedagogy?